What is your biggest concern in this regard?
Well, I have two concerns. One is that inside the United States, the deterioration of American democracy, I mean, it's already happening, right? So it's already creating a class of people who no longer feel they have a stake in the political system and who won't vote, may never vote, and will be outside of politics and outside of the national conversation. That can lead in the direction of violence, that can lead in all kinds of negative directions. We see the development of new kinds of paramilitary in the United States that we never had before, the development of ICE. We've never before had a single national police force wearing combat uniforms, wearing masks, not subject to the normal restrictions of local police forces. We also have a rise in high-end corruption. The president, people around him, companies close to him seem to have access to ways to make money and are making money out of doing politics in a way that was also not possible at that scale in America before. And that's sort of one whole set of concerns if you want to go down one of those roads.
There's this map in front of us on the table. I realize some people can't see because they're listening, but there's a map on the table in front of us. Could you just explain what this map shows and why it's significant?
The map shows the level of democracy around the world. And of course, the thing that's immediately notable to me is that those who made the map don't count the United States anymore as a liberal democracy. Mm-hmm. So a liberal democracy meaning a state where, as I said, the electoral rules are clear, where the electoral system is set up not to favor one party or the next. And instead, it's described as an electoral democracy, which is somewhat less free. You see similar systems in South America. In Europe, you mostly still have liberal democracies. In Australia, Japan, South Korea, you still have liberal democracies. And then most of the rest of the world are some form of autocracy, either very closed and very repressive like China or like Russia, or they are in a democratic gray zone. So there are states that could really go in either direction. I mean, they're still open. But it's true that if you'd looked at a map like this a decade ago or 2 decades ago, it would have been a lot bluer. The blue being democracy and the red or reddish being autocracy. So you do see an absolute process of democratic decline that's been written about by many people over the last few years. I believe very much that states influence one another. People follow and imitate and copy their neighbors.
Do you think it's possible that in our lifetimes, the US might become an autocratic country?
So the U.S. could become what I think on this map is described as an autocratic gray zone. So you could imagine the U.S. as, in effect, a one-party state. So a state where one political party has control and the other just can't win national elections. You already have this system of, we call it gerrymandering, where electoral districts are being written in such a way as to favor one party or another. The effect of that also is that once you have people who don't really have to contest elections anymore, then you have corruption. Because if you're going to win anyway, why do you have to worry about your constituents? Then you have worse government and worse services. Because if you don't have to have an electoral contest, then you can pursue your own interests. You can do favors for businessmen who help you in other ways. And we see this decline of democracy already at the state level. And of course, there could be a danger at the national level of a fixed system that made sure only one party ever wins. And then you would get all these pathologies that we already have at the state level, and we're beginning to have them even now. And remember, we have right now a president who refused to accept the result of an election in 2020 and who staged what was intended to be an electoral coup. It failed. But the idea that he wouldn't do it again or nobody would ever dare to do that or nobody would block an election, I think it's pretty naive at this point. I mean, it happened already. And so, of course, it can happen again.
Do you think he's going to try and get a third term in office?
I don't think so because I don't think he wants one. But I think it's possible that people around him will try to shape and affect the elections in a way that makes sure that a Republican wins.
Or maybe his children?
It's very possible that one of his children will run for president.
Because there's a way to kind of control power in America, when they talk about MAGA, which is, I guess, a collection of people now. You could say J.D. Vance is part of MAGA and the kids and Trump. So maybe they'd want to keep it within MAGA. Maybe that's the...
They might, or they might want to keep it within the family. I mean, look, what is MAGA now? What is different about Trump's second term from Trump's first term? So one of the things that happened after January the 6th, after the attack on the Congress, was that many of the people who'd been around Trump, Republicans, people who do foreign policy, people who do domestic policy, left. They said, right, this is too much for us. We're American patriots. We can't support this kind of attack on our political system. And they departed his presence. But exactly that moment, that attack on the electoral system attracted other people. Mm-hmm. So for different reasons, people who disliked the American political system, who don't like democracy, don't like liberal democracy, thought it was leading America in a left-wing direction. Some of them have political reasons. They were attracted to Donald Trump because they said, right, this is somebody who has the nerve to try and overthrow the system, and we like that. And they're not all the same. They have different views. So there's a tech authoritarian group who want influence over the American political system because it's good for their businesses and because they don't get the point of democracy anyway, and they think they should be in charge. There's a kind of Christian nationalist group who think the United States should not be a secular state. It should be a Christian state, and they are interested in taking over the system with that end. And then there's a traditional MAGA group who think the United States should be run by the people who used to run it, kind of white Christian people of a certain kind, and they want to bring the United States back in that direction. So there are different views, and they don't all agree with each other, but they do agree that the system requires radical change. And that's the difference between the first and second term. So Trump's first term, I think he has never cared much one way or the other for American democracy. He personally sees himself as someone who should be allowed to act in any way he wants. He doesn't like any kind of constraint. He admires foreign leaders who have no constraints. But he was one way or another constrained in his first term by the system. And now he's surrounded himself by people who are seeking to help him avoid those constraints. And that's new.
I think when we have these conversations, we assume that everybody agrees that democracy is the better path.
Sure.
And that they understand the downsides of an autocracy.
So there are different kinds of autocracies, to be clear, and some are more repressive than others. The main thing that you would notice, the first thing that you would notice, would be the absence of the rule of law. Rule of law means that judges and courts and the legal system make decisions based on the Constitution or on the laws. And in an autocracy, you have rule by law. And that means that the law is what the person in power says it is. Mm-hmm. And so if you did a program, for example, and someone on your program said something that was offensive to the leader of the country, you could be arrested and you could be put on trial. And instead of the court saying, right, we've looked at this case, and according to the law, in the law it says we have freedom of speech and you can do whatever you want, somebody could ring up from the Kremlin or from the White House or from whatever is the leadership of your country and say, no, actually we want this guy in jail, and we don't care what the courts think. And that's the big difference. Here I'll tell you a real story that happened in Hungary when Hungary was going down the road in the direction of a one-party state. You can be the CEO of a company, and people can come and knock on your door and they can say, we would like you to sell us a majority share in your company. And you say, no, why should I let you do that? My company, I built it, I invested in it, I don't want to sell it. And then, okay, so what happens the next day? Somebody breaks the windows of your house. A few days later, your children are harassed on the way to school. People who work for you start having legal problems. This or that, some kind of mortgage issue or and suddenly your company encounters regulatory issues. There's a tax inspection. And one by one, the state finds a way to harass you, to harass your company, your workers, so that eventually you say, okay, I give up, I sell, and I'm leaving the country. And this happened to somebody I know.
Sounds like Anthropic in the United States recently, where Anthropic, the AI company, refused to give the United States access to its AI under certain conditions. And then very quickly, Pete Hegseth did a post, I think, and Donald Trump did a post basically saying that they were going to restrict their ability to work with the government.
We aren't used to the idea that the government decides which companies thrive and which ones die. So once you have an autocratic state that can do what it wants legally, then it can decide which companies succeed. It can base government contracts, which are very important in every country, not on who's the best company or not on some kind of blind procurement process, but on who's your friend. Or who's donated to your political party, or who's, in the case of the United States, who's invested in your company. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that we have in the United States for the first time ever, I think, is a president who is actively doing business in countries and in areas that are of interest to the people he's doing business with. So, for example, the Trump family does business in Saudi Arabia. It has a deal with a Saudi company called Dar al-Khan, which is a sort of development company, and that company has close relations to the Saudi leadership. The Saudi leadership is interested in deals with the United States, but political arrangements with the United States, and the money is going into the Trump family coffers in order to make a better arrangement for the country of Saudi Arabia. So that's a way in which, because we have a declining democracy and because we have an increasingly kleptocratic system, decisions are being made by the President of the United States, by the White House, not based on what's good for Americans, but on what's good for his company. And that if you look at Russia, that's exactly how the political system works there. If you look at China, China's more complicated. It's a bigger country. It's more sophisticated. But even there you have, again, decisions made not for the welfare of the Chinese people, but for the ruling party, for the Communist Party.
And we have two jars of money here. This was Trump's net worth when he went into office, $2.3 billion, reportedly. And this is his net worth now, just 2 years later. $6.5 billion. Looks like being a president is a profitable job.
So that has never happened before. This is completely new in American history. There have been presidents there have been whiffs of corruption around them. There's been, presidential relatives who've tried to trade off the president's name, but we've never had a president running businesses while in office. And as I said, in such a way that the people with whom he's doing business are hoping to benefit politically or in other ways. And that's completely brand new. And if you just back to your original question, which is why is democracy better? Churchill was the person who said that democracy is the worst system of government except for all the others. So it's a multi-reasons why it's flawed. Democracies require an immense amount of tolerance. There's always a lot of cacophony. There's a constant flux and change that people find enervating. But at the very least, what democracies can do is they can force issues like this into the public sphere. You're allowed, at least in a democracy, to question whether decisions are being made on the basis that they're good for everybody or they're being made for the benefit of the president.
I guess supporters would say, Trump's not running the businesses himself. It's just his kids' activity that is generating this net worth.
Yeah, but everybody knows that they're his kids. And you wouldn't do it. Why did the Saudi government invest $2 billion in Jared Kushner's fund? It wasn't because they just like Jared Kushner. It was because Kushner is Trump's son-in-law. And now, of course, Kushner is the Trump administration's negotiator in the Middle East. So he's negotiating with his business partners. The appearance of conflict of interest is overwhelming. And as I said, we've never had in American history, or I think in recent British history, we've never had that kind of conflict of interest so clear at that high a level.
Do you spend much time thinking about what's going on in the Middle East, the wars in Iran and Venezuela, and the bigger picture here of what's happening and how this might link back to what you were saying about authoritarian regimes? It's all very confusing. I feel like we went through a period of relative peace through the Biden era. And Trump obviously ran on this promise that he wasn't going to start new wars. And we seem to be having a lot of wars. Russia and Ukraine still raging on, doesn't seem to be nearer to any conclusion. And now there's this war in Iran that threatens to be a never-ending war. Why? What's going on?
There are several things going on. One of them is that in declining democracies and historically in autocracies is you have leaders who conduct wars as a way of consolidating their base and consolidating their support. And so one of the things that Trump likes to do is if he declares a war, I believe he had a different expectation of the Iran war. He's using foreign policy. He's using these fighting of wars in order to consolidate his support at home. So that's a part of what's happening. But some of this has nothing to do with Trump. We are now living in a world where the historical political system, the one that was built after 1945. Some people call it the liberal world order. I don't really like that term because it sounds kind of mushy. But the order that has existed since 1945, the one that was somewhat based on the UN, that was based on a set of rules and treaties, that order has begun to break down. And it's breaking down for several reasons. One, we've started to discuss already, which is changes inside the United States, and the United States was a really important pillar of that order. But it's also breaking down because the autocratic powers, Russia, China, Iran, Venezuela until recently, and others, have been challenging that order for a while themselves. They didn't like the American dominance of international politics in the conversation. They were competing with America at a strategic level, but also in what is really a war of ideas. So let's go back to autocracy and democracy. If you are the leader of Russia or you're the leader of China, what is the thing that is most threatening to you? And the answer is the language of liberal democracy. So all this stuff that we find boring and we're used to, and this idea of freedom of speech and separation of powers and rule of law, all those things that we have come to take for granted in our societies are a huge challenge to the political system in Russia or China. What is Putin most afraid of? He's most afraid of a street revolution of the kind we had in Ukraine in 2014. So when people are standing on the street and they have signs saying, we're against corruption, we want democracy, we want to be in the European Union, we want to be integrated with Europe, he's afraid of that happening in Russia. Because if you live in an autocratic state where you don't have freedom of speech, where there is no justice, where the government decides what all the rules are, then those ideas are explosive and exciting, the same way they were in the 18th century when they first appeared in the Declaration of Independence. And people can be motivated by them, people will go into the street for them, people will risk their lives for them. And the autocrats know that. And so really for the past decade, since 2013, 2014, you see them seeking to spread those ideas, to promote them. I mean, we all know now about Russian propaganda campaigns. We know what Russian disinformation looks like. There's a Chinese version too, which we don't see that much in English, but it appears in other countries. We see them seeking to undermine democracy, trying to spread the influence of a different set of ideas. So the war in Ukraine is exactly that war. The Russians are firstly trying to destroy Ukraine as a nation. They want it to disappear. They're an empire. They want Ukraine to be their colony. And they understood perfectly well that by challenging Ukraine, by invading Ukraine, they were defying this liberal world order. They were defying the rules of post-war Europe. Because in post-war Europe, there was a decision made after 1945, we're not going to invade each other anymore, we're not going to have wars. Instead, we're going to decide everything by diplomacy. Borders will not be changed by force. And the Russians understood that they were breaking that norm. And they invaded Ukraine. They also invaded Ukraine because the Ukrainians were using that language, that powerful democratic language that we take for granted. And Putin said, if they can do it in Ukraine, then people could do it in Russia. And so I need to crush this Ukrainian democracy movement. And so that war really is a fault line between the democratic world and the autocratic world. So I think what you're seeing is the breakdown of an older system that was more or less organized around by American rules.
Through history, which lasts longer? Democracy or autocracy?
Oh, autocracies.
They last longer.
Well, look, if you look back in history, most human societies in most times have been what we would now call autocracy, but they were whatever. They were monarchies. They were led by tribal leaders, by warlords. There have been very, very few liberal democracies, and most of them have not lasted. And I should also say the people who wrote the American Constitution knew that. And when they wrote it, they were reading the history of ancient Rome. There was a Roman Republic, and it fell when it was taken over by Julius Caesar. So they all knew that story. They were reading about the Greek democracies, Athens, which also fell. And when they wrote the U.S. Constitution, they were thinking, how do we make this last? What can we put in it to make it last? It's a longer story whether you think they were successful or not. But everybody who created democracies, whether it was after World War II in Europe, whether it was America in the 18th century, everybody understood that this was a fragile system, and they tried to put checks and balances, judicial, legislative, and executive power. They tried to create systems that would ward off the impulse towards autocracy.
I don't know if you have the answer to this question, but where are people happier on average? In a democracy or in an autocracy?
So I have to tell you, I know a little bit about happiness surveys, and over and over and over again, the happiest place in the world is Finland. Finland, Sweden, Denmark, Norway. Scandinavia is very happy. The reasons for that may not be anything to do with the nature of the political system. We might have other sources, but the happiness is certainly connected to democracy. It's connected to stability, and of course, it's connected to wealth.
Just looking at some research here, it says, while wealth and economic stability are critical for happiness, regardless of the government type, democracy provides additional structural benefits like participation, security, and lower corruption that tend to lift a society's overall life satisfaction.
Well, democracies, by definition, are, at least in theory, the state is structured in a way to benefit everybody, right? At least that's how it's supposed to work. Mm-hmm. So whether it's a national healthcare system or whether it's a system of roads and railroads, the state is building things that are designed to serve everybody. In an autocracy, that doesn't necessarily happen. So in Russia, ordinary Russians have no influence on that decision. They have no way of expressing their views. They can't say what they think. They have no ability to influence the state. They can't say, well, actually, hey, we'd like to build a hospital instead of bombing another city in Ukraine. And so they have very little ability to change the system. And that of course, creates frustration and unhappiness.
If that is true, and this is why I asked the question, if it's better for the people, and at some degree, I think if informed people would choose it, which I think is, and I say the word informed because I understand in a lot of these countries where they don't have democracy, that I'm now using don't have democracy instead of having to say that word again, they limit the access to information so that people don't know what they're missing out on, I guess, or don't have those potentially disruptive ideas. They're not exposed to them on their phones or devices. I would think a person would choose to live in a democracy if given the choice and the information.
I would think so. Although, there are other, there's a deep human need for a sense of stability and security. Hierarchy for some people. And it's true that authoritarians seem to offer that. In a democracy, you do have this constant change of leaders. There's more demands on citizens. You have to participate. If you care about your country, it's not just enough to vote. You need to be involved in politics in some way. And autocracies, I think falsely offer stability. And so the argument of the Russian and Chinese governments and the argument they make in those social media campaigns that they run inside the US or the UK or Europe is exactly that. Authoritarianism is stability, safety, traditional values, hierarchy. And there are people for whom that's deeply appealing. So I wouldn't discount that instinct. And when people like that are also able to control information, when they control the security services, when they monopolize the use of violence, they can be very hard to undo, even if the majority of the country wants something different.
If you love the Diary of a CEO brand and you watch this channel, please do me a huge favor. Become part of the 15% of the viewers on this channel that have hit the subscribe button. It helps us tremendously, and the bigger the channel gets, the bigger the guests.